The morning sun was already beating down on the cracked sidewalk as James Wilson carefully made his way toward First National Bank. At 72 years old, each step was deliberate, his weathered hand gripping his wooden cane for support. The Vietnam veteran had been up since dawn, his old military habits still dictating his daily routine despite the decades that had passed since his service. Today was pension day. Usually James would have deposited his check directly into his account, but his ancient Chevy had finally given up the ghost last week. The repairs would cost more than he had in his checking account, so he needed to cash his pension check right away. The auto shop had promised they could get him back on the road by tomorrow, if he could bring them the cash today. James adjusted his faded military cap as he approached the bank's glass doors. The familiar weight of it on his head always gave him a sense of pride. Though the green fabric had faded to a muted olive and the stitching had been repaired more times than he could count, he wore it almost every day. It was a small reminder of the years he'd given to his country, a quiet symbol of sacrifice that most people didn't notice anymore. The cool air conditioning hit him as he stepped inside, a welcome relief from the summer heat. The bank was unusually busy for a Friday afternoon. Rows of people stood in winding lines, their faces showing various degrees of impatience. James took his place at the end of the longest line, leaning heavily on his cane. His back had been giving him more trouble lately, and standing for long periods made the pain flare up like hot needles down his spine. Shouldn't be too long, he murmured to himself, though the line stretched nearly to the door. The elderly man next to him nodded in silent agreement, both of them settling in for the wait. The minutes ticked by slowly. 10, 20, 30. James shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to ease the growing ache in his legs. He watched as tellers called, "Next!" and people moved forward, some with frustrated expressions, others looking relieved as they completed their business and headed for the exit. Nearly an hour passed before James finally reached the front of the line. By then, his legs were trembling slightly with fatigue and he leaned more heavily on his cane. When the next window opened, he made his way over as quickly as he could manage. The teller behind the counter was young, probably in her mid-20s. Her name tag read Kelly, and she wore her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. She didn't look up as James approached, focused instead on organizing some papers. "Good afternoon," James said with a polite smile, sliding his pension check across the counter along with his ID. "I'd like to cash this, please." Kelly finally looked up, her eyes quickly scanning the check before moving to his identification. Her brow furrowed. "I'm sorry, sir, but your ID is expired." Her voice was flat, matter of fact. James blinked in surprise. "Is it?" He reached for the card and squinted at the date. Sure enough, his driver's license had expired 2 months ago. With everything going on with his car troubles and his doctor's appointments, he'd completely forgotten about it. "I'm sorry about that," he said, his weathered face creasing into an apologetic smile. "I didn't realize, but I've been banking here for over 20 years. Diane usually helps me. She knows me. Is she working today?" Kelly shook her head. "I don't know who Diane is. I just started last month. And our policy is clear. We can't accept expired identification." James felt a flutter of anxiety in his chest. "I understand, but this is my pension check. I really need to cash it today. My car broke down and I need the money for repairs." He lowered his voice, not wanting to create a scene. "Surely there's something you can do. Maybe your manager could verify my identity? I've been a customer here since before you were born." The young teller's expression hardened slightly at his persistence. "Sir, the policy exists for a reason. I can't make exceptions. If I did it for you, I'd have to do it for everyone." An uncomfortable heat crept up James's neck. He wasn't used to asking for special treatment. His generation had been taught to follow rules, to respect authority, but he also needed that money today. "Please," he said quietly. "I don't have any other way to get home without my car. I'm a veteran. I've never caused any trouble here." Kelly's eyes flicked to his military cap, then back to his face without a change in expression. "That doesn't change our identification requirements. You'll need to come back with a valid ID." By now, the line behind James had grown longer. He could feel people shifting impatiently, could almost sense their irritation at the delay. His embarrassment deepened, a flush spreading across his weathered cheeks. "Could I speak to the manager, please?" he asked, his voice steady despite his growing distress. Kelly seemed about to refuse, but then pressed her lips together and picked up the phone. After a brief, hushed conversation, she replaced the receiver. "He'll be out in a moment. Please step aside so I can help the next customer." James stepped away from the counter, his heart beating a little faster than normal. He'd never been turned away from his own bank before. As he waited, leaning on his cane, he heard Kelly call, "Next," and watched as life moved on around him, everyone else getting what they needed without issue. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The bank manager still hadn't appeared. James considered approaching the counter again, but didn't want to cause more trouble. Finally, after 15 minutes of standing to the side, his legs aching terribly now, a man in a crisp navy suit approached. "I understand there's an issue with your identification." The manager, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, spoke in a low tone, clearly trying to keep the conversation private despite the busy lobby. James explained his situation again, the expired ID, his long history with the bank, his urgent need for the car repair money. The manager listened, nodding occasionally, but his expression remained impassive. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wilson, but our policy is quite strict on this matter. Banking regulations require valid identification for all transactions. Perhaps you have another form of current ID? A passport? Military ID?" James shook his head. "My passport expired years ago, and my military ID." He trailed off. That piece of plastic had been replaced by his VA card long ago. The manager's expression softened marginally. "I truly am sorry for the inconvenience, but I can't authorize this transaction without proper identification. Perhaps a friend or family member could drive you to get your ID renewed." The suggestion, though well-intentioned, stung. James had outlived most of his friends. His only son lived 3 states away. There was no one he could call. "I don't have anyone," he admitted quietly. "And I need to get my car fixed. It's my only transportation." A flicker of impatience crossed the manager's face. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but there's nothing more I can do. Bank policy is bank policy." James felt a rare flash of anger. "I fought for this country. I've banked here for decades. And you're telling me you can't verify who I am without that piece of plastic?" The manager straightened, his professional demeanor cooling noticeably. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice." James hadn't realized his voice had risen. He looked around, noticing several customers watching the exchange. His face burned with embarrassment. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," he said, his voice quieter now. "I just need help." The manager adjusted his tie. "I understand, but I've explained our position. You'll need to return with valid identification. Now we have other customers waiting." James stood there, leaning on his cane, feeling suddenly very old and very alone. The unfairness of it all weighed on him like a physical burden. After a moment of uncomfortable silence, the manager cleared his throat. "Is there anything else I can help you with today?" The dismissal was clear. James shook his head slowly. "No," he said softly. "I guess not." The manager nodded curtly and turned to walk away, but then paused and spoke over his shoulder. "Actually, since you're becoming agitated, I think it's best if you leave the premises now. We can assist you when you return with proper identification." James stared at him in disbelief. "Agitated? I'm not." But the manager had already signaled to 2 security guards who stood near the entrance. The men, both young and tall, approached, with practiced neutrality on their faces. "Sir," one of them said, "we need you to come with us, please." A cold wave of humiliation washed over James. People were openly staring now. A woman covered her mouth, whispering to her companion. A young man frowned, looking between James and the guards with confusion. "This isn't right," James said, his voice barely audible. "I'm just trying to cash my check." The guard placed a firm hand on his elbow. "Please don't make this difficult, sir. Let's go." James looked around one last time, hoping someone, anyone, would speak up. But the other customers merely watched, uncomfortable spectators to his humiliation. Some looked away when his eyes met theirs. With as much dignity as he could muster, James allowed himself to be escorted toward the door. Each step was a struggle, his cane tapping against the polished floor, the sound seeming to echo in his ears despite the busy bank. The guards walked on either side of him, not rushing him but making it clear he had no choice but to leave. They reached the glass doors, one of the guards pushed it open. "Have a good day, sir," he said mechanically. And just like that, James Wilson, son, father, veteran, found himself standing alone on the sidewalk, the afternoon sun beating down on his military cap, his uncashed pension check still clutched in his trembling hand. He blinked against the sudden brightness, feeling oddly detached from what had just happened. Cars passed on the street, people walked by, wrapped up in their own lives. No one noticed the elderly man standing lost outside the bank, or the way his shoulders had slumped in defeat. James looked down at the check in his hand. Without it cashed, he had no way to pay for his car repairs. Without his car, he had no way to get to the DMV to renew his license. Without his license, he couldn't cash his check. It was a perfect circle of helplessness, and for the first time in many years, James Wilson felt truly defeated. He tightened his grip on his cane and took a deep breath, trying to figure out what to do next. He had no idea that his life was about to change, or that his path was about to cross with someone who would turn this humiliating moment into something neither of them would ever forget. The sun seemed to beat down even harder now as James stood outside the bank, unsure what to do next. His check remained uncashed, his car still sat broken at Pete's auto shop, and the weight of the day's humiliation pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. For a moment, he considered sitting on the nearby bench to gather his thoughts, but his pride wouldn't let him. Not here. Not where the bank staff might see him through the glass doors looking defeated. He gripped his cane tighter and took a few steps away from the entrance, wincing as his bad knee protested. The VA hospital was too far to walk, especially in this heat. The bus stop was 3 blocks away, and without his car, getting home would mean a long, painful journey with 2 transfers. James sighed heavily, the kind of sigh that comes from deep within, carrying the weight of too many years and too many battles, both in war and in life. Just as he was contemplating his limited options, a sleek black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the curb nearby. The vehicle was massive, clearly custom-made for someone much larger than the average person. The engine hummed to a stop, and the driver's door opened. What emerged was nothing short of a mountain of a man. Standing nearly 7 feet tall with shoulders as broad as a doorway, Shaquille O'Neal stepped onto the sidewalk. He wore dark designer sunglasses, a tailored navy suit that somehow contained his enormous frame, and a watch that caught the sunlight like a mirror. Even people who knew nothing about basketball recognized him instantly. His presence was simply that commanding. Shaq had planned to make a quick stop at the bank before heading to a local children's hospital where he was scheduled to make a surprise visit. But something caught his eye as he locked his car. The slumped shoulders of an elderly man wearing a military cap, standing alone in the heat. Something about the scene didn't sit right with Shaq. He'd been raised to respect his elders, particularly veterans. His own father, Philip Harrison, had been a military man, and Shaq had grown up on army bases, learning the value of service and sacrifice from an early age. The basketball legend changed course, his long strides carrying him toward James. "Excuse me, sir," Shaq said, his deep voice surprisingly gentle for a man of his size. "Are you all right? You look like you could use some help." James looked up and up and up, his eyes widening as he realized who was speaking to him. He'd watched Shaq play basketball years ago, had seen him in movies and commercials. Who hadn't? But seeing him in person was something else entirely. James started, then stopped, embarrassed. He wasn't used to asking for help, especially not from celebrities. "I'm fine, thank you. Just figuring out my next move." Shaq studied the older man. The military cap, the tight grip on the cane, the paper clutched in his hand that looked like a check, and most telling of all, the look of a proud man who'd just been dealt an unfair blow. "Mind if I ask what happened?" Shaq removed his sunglasses, tucking them into his jacket pocket. His eyes were kind, showing genuine concern rather than mere curiosity. James hesitated. Part of him wanted to brush it off, to insist everything was fine. But there was something about Shaq's direct gaze that broke through his defenses. "They wouldn't cash my pension check," he finally admitted, nodding toward the bank. "My ID expired 2 months ago and I forgot to renew it. 20 years I've been banking there and they treated me like I was trying to pull some kind of scam." The words came out more bitter than he'd intended. "Then they had security walk me out," he added quietly, "like I was causing trouble. All I did was ask to speak to a manager." Shaq's expression darkened. "They threw you out? A veteran?" His eyes flicked to James's military cap, then back to the bank's glass facade. James shrugged, trying to downplay it. "It's their policy," they said. "Everyone has to follow the rules." "Some rules need bending," Shaq said, his voice low but firm. "Especially for those who served our country." He extended his massive hand. "I'm Shaquille O'Neal. Friends call me Shaq." "James Wilson," the veteran replied, his own weathered hand disappearing into Shaq's gentle grip. "Vietnam 1969 to 72. Most people just call me Jim." "Well, Jim," Shaq said, "I'd like to help if you'll let me. What exactly do you need that check cashed for?" James hesitated again, the old pride rising up. But practical necessity won out. "My car broke down. It's at Pete's auto shop waiting for repairs, but I need cash to pay for it. Without my car, I can't even get to the DMV to renew my license." Shaq nodded, understanding the perfect circle of problems the older man was facing. "Here's what we're going to do," he said, his tone suggesting this wasn't a mere offer but a plan already in motion. "First, we're going back into that bank together." James looked alarmed. "I don't want to cause any trouble." "No trouble," Shaq assured him with a smile that somehow managed to be both reassuring and determined. "Just a conversation." Before James could protest further, Shaq had already pulled out his phone and was making a call. "Hey Tom, it's Shaq. That auto shop recommendation you gave me last year, Pete's, right?" "Yeah, I need a favor. There's a gentleman named James Wilson who has a car there waiting for repairs." He listened for a moment, then continued. "Perfect. Put it on my tab and have someone bring it to—" He covered the phone and looked at James. "Where do you live, sir?" James, still trying to process what was happening, gave his address. Shaq repeated it into the phone, thanked the person on the other end, and hung up. "That's one problem solved," he said, pocketing his phone. "Your car will be fixed and delivered to your home by this evening." James stared at him, speechless. "But I can't accept that. You don't even know me." "I know enough," Shaq replied simply. "I know you served our country. I know you were just disrespected in there. And I know my father would have done the same for any veteran in need." He gestured toward the bank. "Now, about that check. Ready to go back in?" James felt a strange mix of emotions, gratitude, disbelief, and a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a while, hope. Still, doubt crept in. They already made their decision pretty clear. "Sometimes people need a chance to make a better decision," Shaq said, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who rarely heard the word no. "Trust me on this." There was something about Shaq's certainty that made James straighten up a bit, adjusting his cap with one hand. "Lead the way," he said finally. As they approached the bank's entrance, people on the sidewalk began to notice, a few stopping to point or take quick photos with their phones. Shaq seemed oblivious to the attention, focused entirely on the task at hand. He held the door open for James, who walked through with as much dignity as his aching body would allow. The busy hum of the bank lobby dropped to a stunned silence as Shaq ducked to enter through the doorway. Heads turned, conversations halted, and even the tellers paused mid-transaction. At 6'7", Shaq had that effect on rooms. He didn't just enter them, he transformed them by his very presence. James felt suddenly self-conscious walking beside the basketball legend, aware of all the eyes now fixed on them, but Shaq placed a reassuring hand lightly on his shoulder, the gentle touch at odds with his massive size. "Which one?" Shaq asked quietly. James nodded toward Kelly, the young teller who had refused him earlier. She was helping another customer, but kept glancing their way, her eyes wide with recognition. "And the manager?" James pointed discreetly to the thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, who was now emerging from his office, clearly alerted to the commotion in the lobby. The manager's professional mask slipped for just a moment as he recognized both the elderly veteran who had been escorted out and the unmistakable celebrity now standing beside him. "Mr. O'Neill," the manager said, quickly crossing the lobby with an extended hand and a nervous smile. "What an unexpected honor. How can we help you today?" Shaq ignored the offered hand. "I'm here with my friend, Mr. Wilson," he said, his deep voice carrying easily through the now quiet bank. "He tells me there was some misunderstanding earlier about cashing his pension check." The manager's smile faltered. "Ah, yes. Unfortunately, Mr. Wilson's identification is expired, and bank policy clearly states—" "I understand policies," Shaq interrupted, his tone respectful but firm. "I also understand respect. This man served our country in Vietnam. He's been your customer for 20 years. And you had him escorted out like he was causing trouble." Several customers were openly watching now, a few nodding in agreement. One woman who had been in line during the earlier incident looked particularly pleased at this turn of events. The manager swallowed hard, glancing around at the growing audience. "Perhaps we could discuss this in my office?" "I think right here is fine," Shaq replied. "After all, Mr. Wilson was embarrassed right here in front of everyone. Seems only fair that the apology happens here too." The word apology hung in the air. The manager's face reddened slightly. "Of course, we regret if Mr. Wilson felt..." "Felt?" Shaq raised an eyebrow. "He didn't just feel disrespected. He was disrespected. There's a difference." James stood quietly, beside Shaq, amazed at how the same bank that had dismissed him so easily was now scrambling to make things right. All because of who was standing next to him. The unfairness of it stung, but he also felt a surge of gratitude toward this giant of a man who had decided, for whatever reason, to champion his cause. The manager looked between them, clearly calculating his next move. The entire bank seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. "You're right," he finally said, surprising both James and Shaq with his directness. "We handled this poorly, and I apologize, Mr. Wilson." He turned to face James directly. "Your service to our country deserves better than what you received today. If you'll come with me, I'll personally process your transaction." James nodded, accepting the apology with quiet dignity. But Shaq wasn't quite finished. "I think," he said, looking around the bank lobby, "we all need to remember that policies exist to serve people, not the other way around. Especially when those people served us first." His eyes returned to the manager. "Don't you agree?" The manager nodded quickly. "Absolutely, and I assure you, we'll be reviewing our procedures particularly for our veteran customers." "Good," Shaq said simply. Then he smiled, breaking the tension. "Now let's get my friend's check cashed so he can get on with his day." As they followed, the manager toward his office, James leaned closer to Shaq and whispered, "Thank you. You didn't have to do any of this." Shaq looked down at the veteran, genuine respect in his eyes. "Yes, I did," he replied softly. "Some things are just right, no matter who you are." For the first time that day, James felt the weight lift from his shoulders. Sometimes he realized help comes from the most unexpected places, even 7 feet tall. The manager's office was nothing special, just a small room with a desk, a few chairs, and framed certificates on the wall. But the way he scrambled to clear space and offer the most comfortable chair to James made it clear that something had changed. The same man who had called security less than an hour ago was now acting like James was the most important customer in the bank. "Please, Mr. Wilson, have a seat," the manager said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "And, Mr. O'Neill." He looked around helplessly, realizing none of his office chairs would comfortably fit someone of Shaq's size. "I'm good standing," Shaq said easily, though he had to duck slightly under the ceiling light. He positioned himself beside James, a solid presence that filled the small office with more than just his physical size. There was an energy about him, a quiet confidence that seemed to change the atmosphere. The manager, whose name badge read Richard Taylor, sat down and folded his hands on the desk. "Now about your check, Mr. Wilson. I'd be happy to process this personally for you despite the expired ID. Given your long history with our bank, we can certainly make an exception in this case." James nodded but didn't speak. The sudden change in treatment wasn't lost on him. It wasn't his 20 years of loyalty that had changed the manager's mind. It was the famous man standing next to him. Shaq seemed to read his thoughts. "That's good to hear, Mr. Taylor, but I'm curious, why wasn't this exception possible 30 minutes ago?" The manager shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Well, our policies are quite strict, and the teller was following protocol. New employees tend to be especially careful about rules." "Rules," Shaq repeated, the word hanging in the air between them. "You know, I played basketball professionally for 19 years. Lots of rules in basketball, but the best refs knew when to let some things slide, especially when it didn't hurt the game." He leaned forward slightly. "Your rules just hurt a man who fought for this country." Richard's face flushed. "You're absolutely right, and it's inexcusable. We should have handled this differently from the start." He turned to James. "Mr. Wilson, may I see your check, please?" James reached into his pocket and pulled out the slightly crumpled check, smoothing it on the desk before sliding it across. His pension wasn't large, just enough to cover his basic expenses each month, with a little left over for his grandson's college fund. But it was his, earned through years of service both in the military and later as a high school janitor. Richard processed the transaction, typing information into his computer. An uncomfortable silence filled the room. Shaq broke it with a question that caught both men by surprise. "What's your veterans policy here?" Richard looked up, blinking in confusion. "I'm sorry?" "Your veterans policy," Shaq repeated. "Special services for those who served. What do you offer?" "Well," Richard hesitated. "We don't have a specific veterans program per se. All our customers receive the same level of service." Shaq nodded thoughtfully. "Same level of service? Like what Mr. Wilson received today?" The pointed question hung in the air. Richard cleared his throat. "Point taken, Mr. O'Neill. Call me Shaq," he said, his tone softening slightly. "And I think this bank, all banks really, could do better by our veterans. These men and women gave years of their lives for our country. Some gave limbs, some gave friends. The least we can do is make it easier for them to cash a check." James looked up at Shaq, surprised by the passion in his voice. It wasn't the generic, "thank you for your service" that veterans heard so often. Empty words from people who meant well but didn't truly understand. Shaq spoke like someone who got it, who had seen the sacrifice up close. Richard seemed genuinely thoughtful now rather than simply appeasing a celebrity. "What would you suggest?" "Special hours for veterans," Shaq said without hesitation. "Priority service. Staff trained to understand their unique needs. Maybe even transportation assistance for older vets who can't drive anymore." He glanced down at James. "And some flexibility with documentation, especially for regulars like Mr. Wilson here." Richard nodded slowly, then reached for a notepad and began writing. "These are excellent suggestions. I'd like to present them to our regional manager." "Like to hear what happens with that," Shaq said, pulling out his phone. "Here's my number. Let me know when those changes go into effect." Richard's eyes widened slightly as he accepted Shaq's contact information. What had begun as damage control was now turning into something bigger. "I will personally champion this cause, Mr. O'Neill. Shaq, you have my word." "Good," Shaq said with a smile that transformed his face from intimidating to approachable in an instant. "Because I'll be checking in. I take veterans' issues personally." James watched this exchange in amazement. In the span of an hour, His humiliating experience had somehow transformed into what felt like the beginning of real change, not just for him, but potentially for other veterans who banked here. Richard finished processing the transaction and counted out cash for James, adding a little extra. "I've waived all fees, Mr. Wilson, and added a small goodwill amount to apologize for today's misunderstanding." He pushed the money across the desk. "And please know that your expired ID will not be an issue in the future. I've made a note in your account." James carefully counted the money before tucking it into his wallet. "Thank you," he said simply, his pride still somewhat wounded, but his practical side relieved to have the cash he needed. As they prepared to leave, Richard stood and extended his hand first to James, then to Shaq. "Thank you both for giving us the opportunity to make this right. And Mr. Wilson, please accept my personal apology for how you were treated today." James nodded, accepting the handshake. "Just make sure it doesn't happen to another old vet," he said quietly. "That's all I ask." "It won't," Richard promised, and for the first time since they'd entered his office, he sounded completely sincere. As they left the manager's office, the hushed conversations in the bank lobby died down again. All eyes followed them as they walked toward the exit, Shaq's massive frame dwarfing the elderly veteran beside him. But James walked differently now, back a little straighter, head held higher, dignity restored. Near the door, they passed Kelly, the young teller who had refused James earlier. She looked up from her station, her expression a mix of embarrassment and regret. "Mr. Wilson," she called out softly. "I'm sorry about before. I was just following what I was taught in training." James paused, studying her face. She was young, probably not much older than his grandson. "Sometimes you need to see beyond the rules," he said gently. "Especially when you're dealing with people, not just papers." She nodded, the lesson clearly hitting home. "I'll remember that." Outside, the afternoon heat had lessened slightly as clouds moved across the sun. James breathed deeply, feeling as though he'd just fought and won a battle he hadn't even known he was fighting. "My car will be fixed?" he asked, still not quite believing the turn his day had taken. "Already in progress," Shaq confirmed, checking his phone. "Tom just texted that they're working on it now. Should be delivered to your house by dinner time." James shook his head in wonder. "I don't know how to thank you for all this." Shaq waved, away his thanks. "No need. But I'd like to hear more about your service if you're willing to share. My dad was in the Army. Taught me everything I know about respect." "That explains a lot," James said with a small smile. "He did a good job." "He'd like you," Shaq replied. Then he checked his watch and frowned slightly. "I'm supposed to be at the children's hospital in 20 minutes. Gotta keep that promise to the kids." James nodded quickly. "Of course, don't let me keep you. You've done more than enough." Shaq studied the older man for a moment. "You got a way home? I can drop you." "Off on my way." James was about to say he'd take the bus, his usual pride rising up, but then he thought better of it. Sometimes accepting help was its own kind of strength. "I'd appreciate that," he said instead. As they walked toward Shaq's SUV, a small crowd had gathered nearby, people pointing and whispering. One young boy broke away from his mother and ran up to Shaq, a pen and paper clutched in his hand. "Are you really Shaq?" the boy asked, eyes wide with wonder. "Can I have your autograph?" Shaq smiled down at the child. "Sure thing, little man." He took the pen and paper, signed with a flourish, and handed it back. Then he placed a gentle hand on James's shoulder. "But you should get this man's autograph too. He's a real hero. Fought for our country in Vietnam." The boy looked at James with new interest, taking in the military cap and the weathered face beneath it. "Really? Were you a soldier?" James nodded, somewhat surprised by the question. It had been years since anyone had shown interest in his service. "Marine Corps. Long time ago now." "That's so cool," the boy said with genuine admiration. "My grandpa was in the Army." "Your grandpa's a brave man," James replied, feeling an unexpected lump in his throat. The boy's mother approached, smiling apologetically. "I'm sorry for the interruption," she began, but Shaq cut her off with a friendly wave. No problem at all. Just introducing your son to a true American hero. As they finally climbed into Shaq's vehicle, James taking some time to settle into the passenger seat that seemed designed for someone twice his size, he felt different somehow. The humiliation of the bank incident was fading, replaced by something else, not pride exactly, but perhaps a renewed sense of his own worth. Where to? Shaq asked, starting the engine. James gave his address, then added, if you've got time after your hospital visit, you're welcome to stop by. Nothing fancy, but I make a mean cup of coffee. And I've got some old photos from Nam you might want to see. Your dad might be in some of them, if he was stationed near Da Nang in 71. Shaq grinned, a wide, genuine smile that lit up his entire face. I'd like that, Mr. Wilson. I'd like that a lot. As they pulled away from the curb, James caught a glimpse of the bank through the window. What had started as one of the worst days in recent memory had somehow transformed into something entirely different. All because someone had taken the time to see him, really see him, when others had looked right past. Sometimes, James reflected, the biggest acts of kindness come from the most unexpected people. True to his word, Shaq dropped James off at his modest one-story home in a quiet neighborhood, lined with old oak trees. The small brick house wasn't much, just 2 bedrooms, a living room that flowed into a tiny kitchen, and a backyard where James grew tomatoes in the summer. But it was paid for, and it was his. I'll stop by after the hospital visit if that's still okay, Shaq said as James carefully climbed out of the massive SUV. Doors always open, James replied with a nod. And thank you again, for everything. Shaq waved off the thanks with a smile and pulled away, leaving James standing in his driveway, still somewhat stunned by the events of the day. He made his way inside, his cane tapping against the concrete path, and settled into his favorite armchair, a well-worn recliner that had molded to his body over the years. For a while, he just sat there, replaying the day in his mind. The humiliation at the bank. The unexpected appearance of Shaquille O'Neal. The complete turnaround in how he was treated. It was almost too much to process. Eventually, he rose and moved to the kitchen to start a pot of coffee. If Shaq was really coming back, he wanted to be ready. As the coffee brewed, filling the house with its rich aroma, James opened the hall closet and pulled down a dusty photo album from the top shelf. He hadn't looked at these pictures in years. They brought back too many memories, some good, some painful. But today felt like the right time to revisit the past. He was still flipping through the album when a knock came at the door. Surprised, James checked his watch. It had only been an hour since Shaq had dropped him off. The hospital visit must have been shorter than expected. When he opened the door, however, it wasn't Shaq standing on his porch but a young man in a mechanic's uniform. Mr. Wilson? The mechanic asked, glancing down at a clipboard. That's me, James confirmed. I'm from Pete's auto shop. Got your car outside, all fixed up and ready to go. He handed James a set of keys. Mr. O'Neal covered everything. New alternator, oil change, even had us rotate your tires and top off all your fluids. James stepped onto the porch and sure enough, there was his old Chevy parked in the driveway, looking cleaner than it had in years. That was fast, he said, genuinely impressed. The mechanic grinned. Yeah, well, when Shaq calls and says jump, you kinda just ask how high, you know? Boss had us drop everything and fix it right away. He handed James a clipboard. Just need your signature here to confirm delivery. After the mechanic left, James walked slowly around his car, running his hand along the freshly washed exterior. The old vehicle had been with him for 15 years, not much to look at, but reliable. Until this week, anyway. Having it back and so quickly removed a huge weight from his shoulders. Back inside, James resumed his spot in the recliner, the photo album open on his lap. He was so absorbed in the memories that he almost missed the sound of a vehicle pulling up outside. This time, when he opened the door, Shaq was indeed standing there, ducking slightly to fit under the porch roof. Hope I'm not too early, the basketball star said. The kids were napping when I got to the hospital, so they asked if I could come back this evening instead. Your timing's perfect, James replied, stepping back to let his visitor in. Coffee's just finished brewing. Shaq had to duck even lower to enter the front door, and the ceiling inside was barely high enough for him to stand upright. The sight of the enormous man carefully navigating the small house might have been comical, if not for the respect with which Shaq moved, careful not to disturb anything. Nice place you've got, Shaq said, glancing around at the simple but tidy living room. Photos lined the walls, mostly of a young man who appeared to be James's son and a teenage boy who must be his grandson. It's not much, but it's home, James replied, heading to the kitchen. How do you take your coffee? Black is fine, Shaq answered, easing himself carefully onto the sofa, which creaked in protest under his weight. James returned with 2 mugs, handing one to Shaq before settling back into his recliner. The photo album still lay open on the side table. Are those from Vietnam? Shaq asked, nodding toward the album. James nodded and passed it over. Thought you might want to see them. Your dad was Army, you said? Yes, sir. Staff Sergeant Philip Harrison raised me like I was in the military too, up at dawn, bed made with corners tight enough to bounce a quarter. Yes, sir. No, sir, all day long. Shaq smiled at the memory. Best thing that ever happened to me. Taught me discipline. James nodded in understanding. Military dads are a special breed. Shaq carefully turned the pages of the album, studying each faded photograph with genuine interest. James occasionally leaned over to explain a picture or tell a story about the men in them. They were just boys, really. 18, 19, 20 years old, with eyes that had seen too much too soon. This was our unit, James said, pointing to a group photo. Young men in dirty fatigues stood arm in arm, their faces a mix of smiles and 1,000-yard stares. 2 weeks after this was taken, we lost 3 of them in an ambush. Shaq was quiet for a moment, respectfully taking in the weight of those words. Was it hard? Coming back home after all that? James took a sip of his coffee, considering the question. No one had asked him that in years. Harder than being over there in some ways, he finally admitted. Over there, everything made a terrible kind of sense. Here, people just wanted to forget the war existed, wanted us to pretend we hadn't seen what we'd seen. My dad didn't talk about his service much, Shaq said. But sometimes late at night I'd hear him pacing. Mom said he was walking off the memories. James nodded. We all have our ways of coping. They fell into a comfortable silence, 2 men from different worlds finding unexpected common ground. James was struck by how easy it was to talk to Shaq. No pretense, no celebrity air, just genuine interest and respect. The moment was interrupted by the ringing of Shaq's phone. He checked the screen and raised his eyebrows in surprise. It's the bank manager, he said, then answered. Hello? Mr. Taylor didn't expect to hear from you so soon. James couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but Shaq's face grew increasingly interested as he listened. Occasionally he would say, "That's good," or "interesting," before finally saying, "Send me the details. I'd like to be involved in that." When he hung up, Shaq was smiling. Well, that was fast. Apparently, Mr. Taylor called his regional manager right after we left. They're already drafting a new veterans program for the entire bank chain. Priority service, special hours, transportation assistance, the works. They want to launch it next month and asked if I'd be willing to help promote it. James blinked in surprise. All that from what happened today? Sometimes it just takes a spark, Shaq replied with a shrug. And they're smart enough to know this is good business too. Veterans are loyal customers. Assuming they're treated right, James added. Exactly. Shaq leaned forward, his massive frame making the sofa creak again. And they want you to consult on the program, paid position part-time. Said your perspective as a veteran would be valuable in making sure they get it right. James was speechless. In the span of a single day, he'd gone from being thrown out of his bank to being offered a job by them. The irony wasn't lost on him. I don't know, he said slowly. Not sure I'm the consulting type. Think about it. Shaq suggested. "You've got experience no one else has, and it sounds like a chance to make things better for other vets." The thought was appealing. At 72, James had assumed his working days were behind him. But the idea of doing something meaningful, something that might prevent another veteran from facing the same humiliation he had, that was worth considering. Their conversation was interrupted by another knock at the door. James rose, puzzled. He wasn't expecting anyone else. When he opened the door, a delivery person stood there with 2 large pizza boxes. "I didn't order any pizza," James began. The delivery person checked his phone. "Order placed by Shaquille O'Neal? He said to tell you that talking makes him hungry." From inside, Shaq called out, "Hope you like pepperoni." James couldn't help but laugh as he accepted the pizzas. The day that had started so terribly was ending with him sharing pizza with one of the most famous basketball players in history. Life had a funny way of surprising you. Back in the living room, they cleared space on the coffee table for the pizza boxes. The rich aroma filled the small house as Shaq helped himself to a massive slice. "I figured we could use some fuel," Shaq explained between bites, "because I want to hear more about these photos and I've got an idea I want to run by you." "What kind of idea?" James asked, taking a smaller slice for himself. Shaq wiped his hands on a napkin and leaned forward. "I do a lot of work with different organizations, charities, foundations, that sort of thing. But I've been thinking about starting something specifically for Vietnam vets like yourself. Not just a one-time thing, but an ongoing program. Something that gives back to those who gave so much." James listened as Shaq outlined his vision, a foundation that would provide practical support for aging Vietnam veterans. Home repairs, transportation, medical expense assistance, even simple things like grocery delivery for those who couldn't drive anymore. "The thing is," Shaq continued, "I need someone who understands what these men really need. Someone who's lived it." He fixed James with a direct look. "Someone like you." James set down his pizza, suddenly not very hungry. "Me? I'm just a retired school janitor with a bad knee." "You're a Vietnam veteran who stood up for himself today, who showed me what dignity looks like, even when being disrespected." Shaq's voice was earnest. "I've got the connections and the resources. You've got the experience and the understanding. Seems like a good team to me." As the evening sun cast long shadows through the windows, James found himself considering possibilities he hadn't imagined when he woke up that morning. The humiliating moment at the bank had somehow opened a door to something new, something potentially meaningful. "I'll think about it," he promised, which was more than he would have offered anyone else who'd suggested such a dramatic change to his quiet retirement. Shaq nodded, seemingly satisfied with that response. "That's all I ask." He reached for another slice of pizza. "Now tell me about this guy." He pointed to a photo of a young James standing next to a tall, skinny soldier with glasses. "He looks like he should be teaching math instead of carrying a rifle." James smiled at the memory. "That's Bobby Thompson. Best shot in our unit, believe it or not. Could hit a target at 500 yards that the rest of us couldn't see at 100. He launched into the story, and for the next hour, the unlikely pair, the aging veteran and the basketball superstar, sat in the small living room sharing pizza and stories as if they'd known each other for years. 6 months passed quickly. The crisp autumn air had given way to winter's chill and then to spring's renewal. Now on a bright May morning, James stood before his bedroom mirror adjusting his tie with fingers that weren't as nimble as they once were. His military medals were pinned carefully to his best suit jacket, awards he hadn't worn in public for decades. "You almost ready, Grandpa?" A voice called from the living room. "We're going to be late." "Just about," James called back, giving himself one last look in the mirror. At 72, his face showed every year of his life. The weathered lines around his eyes, the silver hair neatly combed back, the slight stoop to his shoulders that no amount of standing straight could fully correct. But there was something different in his eyes now, a spark that had been rekindled after nearly going out. In the living room, his grandson Michael waited impatiently. At 19, he was the spitting image of James's son, tall and lean with the same determined jaw. He was home from college for the weekend, specifically to attend today's event. "You look good, Grandpa," Michael said, his initial impatience softening to pride. "Really good. Not too shabby for an old-timer," James agreed with a smile, grabbing his cane from where it leaned against the wall. "Let's not keep them waiting." Outside, a sleek black car idled in the driveway. Not Shaq's SUV this time, but a professional car service sent to bring James to the event. The driver, a middle-aged man in a crisp uniform, held the door open with a respectful nod. "Mr. Wilson, it's an honor to drive you today, sir. My father served in Vietnam as well." These small moments of recognition still caught James by surprise. For decades, his service had been something people glossed over or ignored entirely. Now, suddenly, it seemed to matter again. "What unit was he with?" James asked, as he carefully settled into the back seat. As the car pulled away from his modest home, James gazed out the window, thinking about how much had changed since that humiliating day at the bank. Who could have predicted that being thrown out of First National would lead to all this? The weeks following his unexpected meeting with Shaq had been a whirlwind. True to his word, the basketball legend had moved quickly on his idea for a foundation to support Vietnam veterans. He'd assembled a team of experts, lawyers, nonprofit specialists, PR people, but insisted that James be at the center of it all, the guiding voice that kept them focused on what veterans truly needed. At first, James had been reluctant. He'd spent decades keeping his head down, avoiding attention, living quietly. But something about this opportunity felt right. Maybe it was a chance to finally make sense of everything he and his brothers in arms had endured. Maybe it was seeing the real difference they could make in the lives of fellow veterans who were struggling. Or maybe it was simply the right thing at the right time. Whatever the reason, James had surprised himself by saying yes. And that single word had changed everything. The car pulled up to First National Bank's main branch downtown. Unlike the smaller neighborhood location where James had been humiliated 6 months earlier, this was the bank's flagship building, an impressive structure of glass and stone that occupied nearly half a city block. Today, a large crowd had gathered, outside held back by velvet ropes. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes extended skyward. "Looks like quite the turnout," Michael observed, peering through the window with wide eyes. James nodded, a flutter of nervousness in his stomach. Public speaking had never been his strong suit. Give him a mop and a bucket, and he knew exactly what to do. Put him in front of a microphone and a crowd, and his mouth went dry as sandpaper. As they pulled up to the curb, James spotted Shaq standing near the entrance, towering above everyone around him. The basketball star was deep in conversation with Richard Taylor, the manager who had once called security on James. Today, Richard looked different, more relaxed, genuinely enthusiastic, as he gestured toward the building's entrance where a large banner hung, "Veterans First Program Grand Opening," and when Shaq spotted the car, he broke away from the conversation and strode over, his face breaking into a wide grin. "There he is," he called out, opening the car door himself rather than waiting for the driver. "The man of the hour," James felt, his face flush at the attention. "Don't make such a fuss," he grumbled, but there was no real annoyance behind the words. Over the past months, he and Shaq had developed a genuine friendship, an unlikely bond between two men from entirely different worlds who had somehow found common ground. "You ready for this?" Shaq asked, helping James from the car with a gentleness that belied his massive size. "As ready as I'll ever be," James replied, straightening his jacket one last time. Together they approached the bank entrance, Michael following close behind. Richard hurried over to greet them, extending his hand first to James. "Mr. Wilson, thank you for being here today. This program wouldn't exist without you." It was strange how life worked sometimes, James thought as he shook the man's hand. 6 months ago, this same manager had treated him like a nuisance. Today he was being welcomed as an honored guest. The difference wasn't lost on him, but he'd come to understand that people, most people anyway, were capable of change when given the chance. Inside the bank, the main lobby had been transformed. Where there had once been standard teller windows and waiting areas, there was now a dedicated section with a sign reading, Veteran Services. Comfortable chairs, lower counters for those with mobility issues, and private consultation rooms filled the space. Most importantly, the area was staffed by people wearing pins that identified them as veterans themselves, men and women who understood the unique challenges their fellow veterans faced. "What do you think?" Richard asked, clearly proud of the transformation. "It's a good start," James said honestly. "A really good start." A bank employee approached, informing them that the ceremony would begin in 5 minutes. As the small group made their way to the podium set up near the center of the lobby, James felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Kelly, the young teller who had refused his transaction that fateful day. "Mr. Wilson," she said, her expression earnest, "I just wanted to say thank you. After what happened, well, I almost quit banking altogether. I felt terrible, but then Mr. Taylor offered me the chance to join the Veterans First Team. I've learned so much these past few months." She gestured to the veteran's pin on her lapel. "My brother served in Afghanistan. This program means a lot to me, too." James nodded, genuinely touched by her words. "Sometimes the hardest lessons make the best teachers," he said. "You're doing good work here." As they took their places near the podium, James scanned the crowd that had filled the bank lobby. There were reporters with cameras and microphones, bank executives in expensive suits, and, most importantly to James, dozens of older men wearing Vietnam veteran caps similar to his own. Some were in wheelchairs, others stood with canes or walkers, but all watched with interest as Richard Taylor approached the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today for the official launch of our Veterans First program," Richard began. "What started as a single unfortunate incident at one of our branches has transformed into what we believe will be a model for financial institutions nationwide." James listened as Richard explained the features of the program: priority service for veterans, special accommodations for those with disabilities, assistance with documentation issues, financial education tailored to veterans' benefits, and even transportation services for elderly veterans who could no longer drive. It was far more comprehensive than James had initially imagined. None of this would have been possible without two very special people, Richard continued. First, a man who needs no introduction, Shaquille O'Neal, whose advocacy for veterans comes from the heart, and whose influence helped turn a single conversation into a nationwide initiative. Applause filled the lobby as Shaq nodded in acknowledgement, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "But even more importantly," Richard said, his voice softening, "we owe this program to a man who taught us all a valuable lesson about respect, dignity, and the debt we owe to those who served our country. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. James Wilson." The applause was thunderous as James made his way to the podium, leaning slightly on his cane. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. For most of his life, he had been invisible, just another aging veteran whose service had been largely forgotten by the country he'd served. As he looked out at the sea of faces, James felt a moment of panic. What could he possibly say that would matter? He wasn't a speaker or a celebrity. He was just an old man who had stood up for himself when it would have been easier to walk away. But then his eyes found his grandson in the crowd. Michael was watching, him with such pride that it steadied James's nerves. Next to Michael stood Shaq, the unlikely friend who had changed everything with a simple act of kindness. And beyond them, James saw the other Vietnam veterans, men who had walked the same jungle paths, faced the same fears, and come home to the same indifference that he had. Men who now stood a little taller, knowing that someone remembered their sacrifice. James cleared his throat and leaned toward the microphone. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, his voice rough but clear. "Never have been, but I know something about service, about doing what's right even when it's hard, about standing up when it would be easier to sit down." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "What happened to me at the bank 6 months ago happens to veterans every day in different ways. We become invisible, our service forgotten. But it only takes one person willing to see us, really see us, to change that." James glanced at Shaq, who nodded encouragingly. "This program isn't just about making banking easier for veterans, it's..." about remembering that behind every veteran's cap, every military ID, every service-related disability, there's a person who gave a piece of their life for this country. All we ask in return is to be treated with the same respect we showed when we put on the uniform. As James continued speaking, his initial nervousness faded. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore, but for all the veterans who had never had the chance to be heard. For the brothers he'd lost in Vietnam. For the men who had come home changed in ways that civilians couldn't understand. When he finished, the bank lobby erupted in applause once more. Shaq approached the podium, engulfing James in a careful hug before taking the microphone himself. When I saw this man being escorted out of a bank 6 months ago, I didn't see a customer with an expired ID, Shaq said. I saw my father. I saw every veteran who ever felt forgotten, and I knew I had to do something. He turned to face James directly. What you taught me, Mr. Wilson, is that real heroes don't wear capes or play basketball. They wear faded military caps and carry the weight of their service quietly. They don't ask for recognition, but they sure as hell deserve it. As the ceremony concluded and the formal ribbon cutting took place, James found himself surrounded by fellow Vietnam veterans, each with a story to share, each expressing gratitude for a program that finally acknowledged their unique needs. One elderly veteran in a wheelchair gripped James's hand tightly. I haven't been able to get to my bank in 3 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Now they're sending someone to pick me up once a month. You did that, brother. You did that for all of us. Later, as the crowd began to disperse, James stood quietly with Shaq and Michael, watching as the first veterans were already being served at the new dedicated counters. Not bad for a day that started with getting thrown out of a bank, Shaq said with a gentle nudge to James's shoulder. James smiled, thinking about the strange path that had brought him here. One moment of humiliation had sparked a movement that would now help thousands of veterans across the country. One chance encounter with an NBA legend had led to a friendship he never could have imagined. Life's funny sometimes, James said simply. What's next? Michael asked, looking between the two unlikely friends. Shaq grinned. Veterans Housing Initiative. Your grandpa's already got the plans drawn up. Man doesn't know how to retire properly. James shrugged, unable to hide his own smile. Turns out I wasn't quite done serving after all. As they walked together toward the exit, James realized something important. The day he'd been thrown out of the bank had felt like an ending, one more door closing on an aging veteran. Instead, it had become a beginning, not just for him, but for countless others who had served and sacrificed. Sometimes, James thought, the worst moments can lead to the best changes. Sometimes it just takes one person willing to stand up and another willing to stand beside them. And sometimes heroes come in the most unexpected forms, even 7 feet tall, wearing size 22 shoes.